Welcome to the Waking Up Podcast. This is Sam Harris. There's been an interesting thing happening. I don't quite know what this means, but I've been noticing in the last few weeks that when I've said things that are overtly disparaging of religion, I've been getting pushback from my audience in ways that I never have before. What I think has happened here is that I have spent enough time off the topic of atheism and religion, sort of conflict between science and religion, that I've attracted new podcast listeners, mostly, who are not so familiar with my work on that topic. So I noticed this in two places. First, in my last podcast with Andrew Sullivan and David Frum in D.C., I had said at one point when debating the validity of religion with Andrew, something about not having to believe any bullshit to lead a moral life. And my calling, in this case, Catholic dogma bullshit, was deemed offensive by some people. I remember there were probably some people in the room who felt that, and there were definitely some people who reached out by email to communicate that to be so disparaging of a religious tradition was unbecoming in me or counterproductive. All I can say is, if you were to read my first book, The End of Faith, or my second book, Letter to a Christian Nation, there are perhaps some surprises in store for you. It really comes down for me between the difference between believing things for good reasons and believing things for bad reasons. And good reasons are the province of rationality and science and honest conversation. And bad reasons are the province of self-deception and wishful thinking and conscious fraud and dogmatism. And there's nowhere where these latter attributes are given more energy than in the context of religion, where they get rebranded as faith and promoted to the pantheon of human virtues. So all I can say is that there are some surprises in store, perhaps unpleasant, if you look at what I've said and written about religion in the past. The other piece of data I have here is I recently put out a meme on social media, which took a quote which came from one of my talks. I think it came from my debate with William Lane Craig. And the quote is, "The true horror of religion is that it allows perfectly sane, intelligent people to believe by the billions what only lunatics or imbeciles could believe on their own. If you think that saying a few Latin words over your pancakes is going to turn them into the body of Elvis Presley, you have lost your mind. But if you believe more or less the same thing about a cracker in the body of Jesus, you're just a Catholic." So Paul Lachine, the artist who made my slides for my TED Talk on AI, made this meme, and the 16th meme he's made for me, which are all visually quite cool, whatever you may think about the quotation. So I put this out on Facebook and Twitter and saw a surprising degree of pushback. Many people were just aghast that I would take literally what was only meant to be a metaphor. The doctrine of transubstantiation is not a metaphor. I'm just going to read you from the Catechism of the Catholic Church, lest there be any doubt on this. Quote, "Because Christ, our Redeemer, said that it was truly his body that he was offering under the species of bread. And it has always been the conviction of the Church of God, and his Holy Council now declares again, that by the consecration of the bread and wine there takes place a change of the whole substance of the bread into the substance of the body of Christ our Lord, and of the whole substance of the wine into the substance of his blood. This change the Holy Catholic Church has fittingly and properly called transubstantiation." End quote. This is not a metaphor. Those who now think it's a metaphor have lost their faith in the actual doctrine. So I certainly stand by my claim that if you believe this about any other substance and any other person, in this case pancakes and Elvis, that would be virtually synonymous with there being something wrong with your mind. Right? That this is disordered thinking. This would be a delusion, but a delusion that is shared, or at least endorsed, by millions and millions of people can't be called a delusion. In fact, and this is my point, the horror of religion is that it allows perfectly sane, intelligent people, right, people who are not suffering from some disorder of their thinking, to believe by the billions what only people who are psychologically compromised could believe on their own. There's a kind of epistemological safety in numbers. But it doesn't mean the beliefs are any more rational. It just means they're well subscribed. It takes a different sort of mind to strongly believe something just as incredible on one's own. Right? And this is why we treat cults differently from mainstream religions. Right? There's more of a social sacrifice, and the fact that a person is willing to make that social sacrifice means something. And in the ultimate case, the person who believes something that is completely unintelligible for the rest of humanity, well, that sort of sacrifice in isolation usually signals something about that person. In any case, it's amusing to see that I apparently have many listeners who don't realize just how deep my atheism runs, and I would just say that reading my first two books would certainly be the cure for that. Okay, so just a couple of things to announce. My next live event is in Chicago with Lawrence Krauss and Matt Dillahunty. And in fact, today's podcast is the audio from our New York event. We will certainly strive to not repeat ourselves in Chicago and in Phoenix after that. We have 2 events on the calendar. So after you listen to this audio, if you have questions you want us to hit, please email them or tweet them. Probably a few days before the Chicago event, we'll go out on social media and actually ask for questions. That's really the best way to guarantee that we don't cover the same ground. And as far as other events, there are still tickets for many that are coming up. I have my first book club event with Steve Pinker in Los Angeles in the middle of March. And a second book club event is now scheduled. I will announce that in a few weeks, but that's going to be with Antonio Damasio, the neuroscientist, who has a new book. And there should be many events hitting the calendar soon here, so if you're interested in coming to a live event, you can go to samharris.org/events. And as most of you know, those tickets become available to supporters of the podcast early and usually stay available only to supporters for the first 10 days or so. And now for today's episode. You've heard me with Lawrence Krauss before on the podcast. Lawrence is a physicist who will be familiar to most of you. And Matt Dillahunty has moderated a couple of discussions I had with Richard Dawkins, and you've heard him here as well. So without more introduction, I'll just say we get into several interesting topics here. We talk about nuclear war and Christian support for Trump. Trump does not come up much. Many of you will be happy to know. We talk about science and a universal conception of morality. We talk about the role of intuition in science, the primacy of consciousness as a fact, the nature of time, free will, the illusion of the self. Lawrence does not agree that it's an illusion. We may have to cover that topic again. And there's a few more topics here. In any case, it was a fun event. It was great to meet so many of you afterwards. These particular events are always followed by book signings, so the event itself was just an hour and a half, but the book signing winds up going for 2 hours or so. And that really is the chance to say hi. So if you enjoy this conversation, there will be 2 others with the same participants in Chicago and Phoenix coming up. So if you live close to either of those cities, feel free to come on out. Otherwise, I will try to get the audio and release it here. And now I bring you the event I did in New York with Lawrence Krauss and Matt Dillahunty.
Ladies and gentlemen, it is my great privilege and honor to introduce the gentlemen who will be joining me on stage. Please welcome Sam Harris and Lawrence Krauss.
All right. Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
They're standing, you just can't see it.
Yeah.
We really
There
can't
are
see
people
you.
in there. It's not a sound.
Don't take lack of eye contact personally.
Yeah.
We'll bring the lights up before we get to the Q&A. How are you, gentlemen?
Good, good.
I have a disclaimer.
A disclaimer.
Yes, as you know, but they don't. I came down with food poisoning 2 nights ago. So if I either vomit or have to run off stage, it's not because of anything these two gentlemen have said. Okay, that's what I'm gonna
Maybe if he liked you better,
say.
feel better.
That's all right.
We'll see who runs off stage faster.
Yeah. Yeah.
I promise not to run off stage, mostly because I'm in boots that won't allow me to run anywhere. So today, you know, we're going to be doing 3 of these. New York is the first time for the 3 of us together. And something happened today that was all over the news, and I thought it might be an interesting spot to start. Hawaii had an incredible false alarm today where an emergency alert system sent out a text message essentially saying that a ballistic missile had been detected heading towards Hawaii and to seek cover, and this is not a drill. And 39 minutes later, they announced that it was a false alarm. And it both intrigued me and terrified me about the new world that we live in compared to, you know, when I was a kid. Technology that's there to save our lives, and yet things can go wrong because we're fallible. Are we better off if we're terrifying people with false alarms? And how do we go about dealing with a new world where technology is in everybody's hands and can be used and abused?
Well, maybe
we are in a context where it's plausible to worry that missiles could be headed toward Hawaii, so that's the underlying problem. But
yeah, but
say something about the
I think
doomsday
people
clock.
aren't worried about it enough. I think in just a little under 2 weeks, I'll be going to Washington to announce the new value of the doomsday clock. I'm the chairman of the board of the Bolton Atomic Scientists, as you know. And one of the things that worries me is that I think people have become very complacent about nuclear weapons. Because they haven't been used in over 70 years, people tend to think they'll never be used. And the real problem is that this kind of thing became public. But there's a great book called Command and Control, which is terrifying, and you realize how many close calls we've had. It's kind of amazing that there hasn't been either an accident or panic. And
If you haven't read it, that's Eric Schlosser, his book, and there was a PBS documentary done on it, and you should either read it or watch that documentary.
read it, but you know, have a bottle of scotch or something when you're reading it, because it is really terrifying, as it should be. And so part of the problem, in fact, of this, there's a lot of problems that people don't realize, that in fact, because intercontinental ballistic missiles act relatively quickly, you know, in 25 or 30 minutes, that they can do their work and do most of the way around the Earth. We still live in a world where the United States and Russia both have about 1,000 weapons on a status where they're prepared to respond immediately. And as a lot of people, I didn't want to mention this word, but until a guy whose name I won't mention came in the White House, people didn't realize this, and I actually didn't realize it either until I was writing a piece. But people now know, and if you don't, you should know this, that there is no safeguard against the president launching nuclear weapons. There's no one he or she would have to ask. There's no one who can say no, and there's no constitutional check on that. And recently, some Congress people did discuss producing such a check. During the Cold War, there was perhaps the height of the Cold War. There was some reason for that, because there were 20,000 nuclear weapons that Russia and then the Soviet Union and the United States were aiming at each other, and the idea was you have to launch them quickly. But now there isn't that reason, and yet we still have that, and that itself is terrifying, because if that warning had not got, and by the way, the warning I understood was due to a shift change, and someone pressed the wrong button when they went off the shift. This is true.
Now, that raises a problem, when I have to check out at the grocery store and swipe my credit card, I have to click yes like 18 times just to pay for my Coke. How is it? How could you possibly hit the wrong button in a shift change and not get a, hey, are you sure you want to send this message?
Yeah. But imagine that went not to the sensible but scared people in Hawaii, but imagine that went right to the White House. Okay?
Well, and to read command and control is to witness how, by sheer dumb luck, we've avoided nuking ourselves, one another, and even ourselves. We just
So many
literally
times.
dropped live nukes on North Carolina,
Yeah.
and 2 of 3 safeties failed. And the final safety was like a manual toggle switch that was just in the right position.
And
It's just
and in silos, the book begins with a potential nuclear weapon exploding in a silo. It is truly amazing, and it really argues for something that we've been arguing at the Bulletin, and certainly I try to write about, which is that we are safer with fewer nuclear weapons and not more nuclear weapons, because the more you have, the more likely there will be an accident or a false alarm. And yet we're in a situation right now where there are no arms control treaties. And what I was going to say at the beginning, which I think we were talking about beforehand, is what discourages me when I write about nuclear weapons compared to almost anything else I write about in the popular media, there's less interest. I don't know whether people don't want to think about it, or they're just so complacent.
Armageddon is boring.
Yeah, Armageddon, I guess, is boring, or you don't want to think
Can
about
you
it.
say what you said about William Perry's opinion? Is that for public consumption?
I don't know.
It's just us.
Thanks, Sam. I'll think of something back. But William Perry, I'll use this as an opportunity. We'll be at my Origins project in Arizona. We'll be having it.